what exactly has made it so popular? Because we didn't exactly have a spearhead figure like a Lenin, Stalin, like a
Yeah.
Hitler. This has kind of
Yeah.
almost happened overnight, but over time at the same time.
Yes, we
So,
have a strange and interesting background to this one. There's a
yeah.
gentleman by the name of William Easterly, recently released a book called The Tyranny of Experts. And the name is somewhat misleading because it sounds as though he's picking on experts in general across a range of fields. And in fact, he's not. This is a man who spent, I think it's the last 40 or 50 years as part of economic think tanks, particularly specializing in the project of assisting African nations with economic development. And his conclusion at the end of this book is he basically says his entire life's work has done more damage than good. And he wrote this book to point out why this concept of economic experts going to African governments and proposing these ideas causes so much harm. And he goes country by country and decade by decade. And the amount of research he's put into this and personal experience, he has been a part of these projects, is just staggering. And he basically says there is a simple thing that goes wrong, but it is the most important thing that is going wrong. In order for any nation, any group of people to prosper anywhere around the world, in essence, you need two things, but you absolutely have to have them. They are non-negotiable. The first is freedom, and the second is rule of law. Now, what gets mixed into this one is a grand social vision, and that one is where it all goes wrong. So let's just start with those first two pillars, freedom and rule of law. If you have no freedom, for example, you go back to a system like Europe had, say, a few hundred years ago with feudal lords, you would have had very stern rule of law. There is absolutely law in place, but there was no individual freedom for most people to do what they wanted to do with their lives. You couldn't just start a business or in any material way enrich yourself or work for your family. You worked for the chief, the lord, the feudal lord, the boss, whatever the case might be. And that has been the case for most of human history in most places on Earth. Freedom is a relatively new idea. In places like Great Britain was really perhaps the first country to properly combine those two ideas. Back to even medieval, the medieval time period, they were one of the few places on earth where rule of law was external to the rulers. As a result of this contract that they signed, the Magna Carta, which limited the powers of the king, they had this growing constitution, a set of sort of legal laws, essentially, that were not based on the whim of a king or a chief or a lord. And that was an extraordinarily new idea. And they were uniquely good at applying these rules to everybody relatively equally. So, for example, even in, say, 14 or 1500, you would have a British merchant, and someone would come over from, say, what we would now call France or Germany or Flanders, and they would feel that they have had a deal that has gone south with this British merchant. The foreigner could apply to the courts to have their case heard, and in many cases, the court would find in favor of the foreigner. Now, that was, again, an unusual thing in human history. And as a result of this combination of Britons having the freedom to become shopkeepers and to build businesses and so forth, and the rule of law that upheld contracts and protected them, they became one of the wealthiest nations the world had ever seen. You can have freedom without rule of law. Take, for example, the issue of a failed nation, a failed state. You have all the freedom in the world. There is no government. However, the second you start to make any progress, the local gang, mob, pirate, chieftain, whatever, will come and take away what you have built. So you have the freedom to operate, but you are not protected. Your individual rights, your property rights are not protected. So freedom and rule of law, those are your two necessary conditions for prosperity. Now enter these economists who go and advise African governments. And for some odd reason, many of them, in fact, almost all of them, come from France. And French intellectuals have this long-standing love affair with Marxism. They go into these nations, it's the most bizarre thing, Thomas Piketty being possibly the worst example today. And much of my book is about debunking Piketty. They will go to these African nations and they say, don't worry about human rights. Don't worry about all of the things that ultimately led up to the prosperity seen in other nations. You can bypass that step and just have a strong plan. Your government can lead the economic growth. And it doesn't work that way. Economic growth comes from businesses doing business. To get businesses doing business, you need freedom and you need rule of law. Without those in place, you don't get the results. So in many cases, they are cheated out of their own human potential. And I think it's a very important thing for people in African nations to know. What we want more than anything else is freedom and rule of law. Then get out of the way. When a government starts talking about its social vision, its grand plan, how it's going to lead the way, that's when you're heading for trouble.
Right.
Sure.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, I was listening to Ramaphosa. Oh, I wasn't listening. I actually was watching Ramaphosa. And,
I just wait for the memes to come out.
Yeah. And he said something very interesting where he was talking specifically with regards to this vision of South Africa, where they want to be ruled via some sort of equality, justice, and all these type of things.
Yeah.
And again, when you look at it in essence, it's just nothing more than a plan that's just designed to get more debt and stuff like that. So, I mean, in South Africa specifically, do you think that this vision, is it playing any role or is it playing no role
No,
whatsoever?
it's making everything worse. I'll give you some genuine reasons for that. One of the contributing factors to the wealth of England was its total lack of an imposed vision. Their law uniquely was built from the ground up rather than being imposed from the top down. So, for example, if you even take competing nations right next door across the channel, like France at the time, they had a very different setup. The law was given to them by those in charge. English law was built from the ground up by trials, and there essentially was no grand social vision. That became the wealthiest nation in the world. It was quickly overtaken by the United States becoming the wealthiest nation in the world. Now, what was the founding idea of the United States? Now, regardless of where it is today, and that's, again, a whole different discussion, their founding idea was, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And it was this idea that the individual is inviolable and has a relationship with God, and you can't touch that. Then you build a government around it. And you can only build a government in such a way that you do not impede the individual with a relationship with God. Now, the opposite of that is a strong central planner with a vision for what you must do. Well, if there's a vision for what we must do, then people are going to have to be told to or forced to or coerced to do it. Then they are not free. Then you've gotten rid of that one pillar that was so necessary, the freedom. And it looks at human beings as though they are a tool for a leader to do something. That has been the formula for most of human history, and it has been why it has taken us so long as a species to escape poverty. In those two notable places where that was not done, both nations were in their respective times the wealthiest place on earth.
This is effectively, I would say, the basis for a dictatorship then.
Yeah. And it's a soft dictatorship, and it's sold as kindness. But then, of course, you ask the question, which dictatorship has not been sold as kindness? You know, the kind of language that we hear, especially the youth and students today, using as they build what they think is this woke and enlightened new sort of future, is all about for the greater good and inclusivity and equality, and it's all the same language used to build the Soviet Empire. It's identical. In fact, one of the points that I make in this book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good, is I trace the use of the phrase political correctness. I ask the simple question, where does it come from? And the first time that academics have ever been able to find it used in a publication was in the year 1921 in Soviet propaganda. It comes from the Soviet Union. Now, you can still go back another 30 years, and when radical agitators prior to the Russian Revolution were talking about bringing about this new utopia, they called it democratic socialism. And you hear kids today going, well, it's not the same thing as communism. What we want is democratic socialism. Yeah, that's 150 years old. We've seen this movie before.